I would like to introduce the speakers, but unfortunately, one of the speakers isn't here because they're stuck on a bus after their train broke down. So Corinna, who's a reader based in the Social and Public Health Sciences unit at the University of Glasgow, luckily pre-recorded her talk, so I'm just going to play this part of the webinar, and then we'll pass over to Lawrence, who's a professor in the School of Psychology here at the Psychology and Neuroscience, and who'll talk through the second part of the webinar. What I suggest is we'll maybe take questions at the end of both presentations. It should take about 30 minutes, and we'll have some time for discussion at the end. Okay. So, Larry, if you can just give me a thumbs up to confirm that this is playing and the audio is coming through okay. And I'll just leave it to play for about 10 minutes.
Well, welcome to this webinar series from the SOCITS project. I'm going to talk about why we think about social situational systems in the first place, and give you a very broad brush introduction to complexity, complex systems, and how that is the underlying conceptualization for SOCITS. So what is complexity? Well, it's surprisingly hard to define, right? Wikipedia says a complex system is a system composed of many components which may interact with each other. You can already see from that definition there's a link to another wiki page on systems. So there are different kinds of systems. They're non-complex systems, right? And for example, a road network is a system of roads. They're parts, they're individual roads, and they're connected to each other, like this road network of Milton Keynes. So it's a system, but it's not a complex system. There are no interacting parts. Okay. Here we can represent a road network in a simpler form like this grid. Just imagine that these are roads that are interconnected, and we can add cars. So now we have a slightly more complicated system because we have the road network and we have cars sitting in the road network, but it's still, they're not interacting with each other. They're just sort of sitting there. But once we add drivers to the cars, we are getting behavior within the system, like these tailbags at the red lights, for example. And if there was a car accident, I promise you we would have an emergent traffic jam in no time at all. So here we can see sort of that there are that systems are composed of different interacting parts. Parts become a system, but complex systems are systems where you have these interacting parts, like, for example, drivers in cars in a road network. Whilst it's difficult to define, other than by example, which I've just given you, complex systems do have certain properties, and they're represented in the poster on the right-hand side. This poster is part of a project I was co-investigator on. It's called the Center for Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus. And we really looked at what complexity means for policy evaluation, how we can develop methods for policy evaluation and complexity. And so this poster is showing different attributes of complex systems. And whilst not all these properties have to be present in all complex systems or at all times in a complex system, many of these properties are there in complex system situations. What is important for us is that recognizing complexity is recognizing the interconnection of parts, so that people interact with each other, that people interact with an environment in which they're situated, people are interacting within an institutional environment in which they are, and a recognition of time, that a complex system means because things are interacting and these interactions are happening in time, that a complex system means you have a development and change over time. These are probably the two most important things to keep in mind. That taking a complexity approach to anything means that we have time and change, and that we have this interconnection between system parts, system components, individuals within a system. Other properties that are really important and are often present within complex systems is feedback, emergence, unpredictability, and Complex systems being open systems in the sense that you can't necessarily decide where your system stops and where the environment in which your system is situated begins. So these are all really important aspects of complex systems. What it means to recognize complexity within a social science context means that we have to stop thinking about the social world the way we might have done before, that we can compartmentalize the social world, that we can just measure everything, and that we can control the social world. A recognition of complexity means that we recognize that we are dealing with people, that people are interacting with each other, that things are interwoven, and some things are just not measurable, right? They're still important, even though we can't necessarily measure them with the instruments that we used to have. And this contextual situatedness of complexity. So with SOCITS, we're really taking a complex systems approach to understanding youth mental health by investigating youth mental health as situated in time and space, situated in social interactions, and that it's resulting from a multitude of interactions in different contexts. So, for example, we understand the outcome of youth mental health as resulting from these cumulative episodes of stress that pupils experience during a school day. And these episodes of stress are situated. They're situated in time, space, social interactions, and in the rules and regulations or the institutional context of a school. Now, complexity has two dimensions, in particular when we look at social complexity or social science complexity. And so far we have looked at this idea that a complex system is a system of interacting parts. And that's fair enough. We have simple systems, we have complicated systems, and we have complex systems. And here we have three examples. A clock is a fairly simple system consisting of a few cogs that interact in a nicely mechanical way, and is very reliable. It just gives you the time. That's its purpose. When it comes to a rocket, well, it's not rocket science, but when it comes to a rocket, we have a complicated system. There are many interacting parts in a rocket. There is all the mechanical parts, but there's also a fuel system. And all of these things have to interact with each other, but it's a very, very nicely bounded and defined system, a rocket. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to send it to the moon, for example, right? It has to be very predictable. Whereas complexity, proper complex systems, are those that are very, very hard to predict, like raising a child. A child is a complex system in itself, and whilst you might think that you have quite a lot of influence on your child, especially as they get older, there are loads of other influences that you have absolutely nothing to do with, like their peers and their school, for example. So where the child in itself is a complex system evolving over time. Now, this is the many component complexity I talked about so far. But in the social sciences, we have to also see another kind of complexity. And we can think about that as the far from agreement or many views complexity. And what that means is that different individuals experience a social complex system in different ways. For example, a student who loves learning and has good academic results will experience school totally differently from a student who struggles academically. A student who's very popular and has loads of friends will experience school completely differently from somebody who gets bullied. Okay? A teacher's experience is completely different from a pupil's experience of school or from an Ofsted inspector. And there are questions of power, there are questions of autonomy, there are questions of equity. And all of these have to be looked at. There are differences in meaning ascribed to parts of the social system. And so SOCITS really takes these two dimensions of complexity, the many components that are interacting in time and space and socially, as well as the many views kind of complexity that results from different experiences, different meanings attached to the system, and different ways of different ways of conceptualizing and feeling the system. And how SOCITS is doing this is by developing and applying loads of different methods to understand and really get under the skin of the complexity of youth mental health. And what we're doing is we have walking interviews, for example, to really understand the situatedness in time and space, to understand how, for example, the architecture of a school influences people's conceptualization and experiences. We have surveys and psychometrics to measure whatever we can measure in a complex system. Complexity doesn't mean you can't measure anything. Complexity just means that you have to acknowledge some things might be unmeasurable. We have workshops and the SOCITS Square to really understand how different people view and experience the system and attach meaning to the system. And we have agent-based modeling to model through the dynamics that we are finding through other methods of how students are interacting within the school and how stress can build up cumulatively, but also dissuade over time, and what the sort of the social outcomes are of individuals experiencing stress in different ways. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand over to Lawrence now.
Okay, well, thanks very much to Corinna for the recording of that talk. What I'll do is I'll keep an eye on the chat to see if any questions, but I'll just pass straight over to Larry to give the next presentation. Larry, you okay to share your slides? Okay, go.
Can you see my slides?
Yeah, that's in presenter view now. Yep, all good. Okay.
And can you see my cursor?
Yeah, I can.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. I'm going to continue talking about some of the foundational concepts in the SOCITS approach. You just heard from Corinna about complexity, and I'm going to talk about assessment in situations, and as you'll see, tie them back in to complexity. Oops, just lost my, oops, sorry. Can you still see my screen and hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
So we perform assessment all the time. When we measure the temperature outside, we're measuring the environment. But what we're interested in, and we are actually measuring the environment to some extent in SOCITS by measuring important situations in school settings that affect people's stress and loneliness. But here I'm going to focus on assessing individuals themselves, assessing students in particular. We assess individuals all the time in all sorts of different ways. So we can assess someone biologically, measuring their height or their blood pressure, whether they have a COVID infection or not. We measure students all the time educationally, measuring their mathematical skill, for example. The kind of assessment we're focusing on here in SOCITS is psychological assessment, also known as psychometrics, which perhaps began with the controversial measurement of intelligence decades ago, personality, things like depression, stress, loneliness, and so forth. We've developed tens of thousands of psychometric tools for measuring all sorts of psychological qualities for decades, and it's one of the most developed areas of modern psychology. So why might we want to assess individuals in these ways? Well, first of all, it can lead to greater understanding of them, especially if they're experiencing difficulties of some sort. If they're experiencing difficulties, we can use these tools to diagnose what's going on. And once we have some sense, some understanding of what's causing the difficulty, we can then select appropriate treatments that we have found to be effective in the past. So for example, if we assess someone's blood pressure and find that it's high, we can prescribe exercise and diet. Similarly, if we measure someone's, say, introversion or shyness, and we find that they're shy, we can suggest that they work on developing their social skills. So let's look a little bit more closely at how psychological assessment typically works, because this typical approach is central to what we're up to in SOCITS, and it actually harks back to what Corinna was talking about in terms of compartmentalization. It's a very compartmentalized approach to dealing with the world and dealing with complexity. But typically the way psychological assessment works is you figure out what quality you want to measure. So I'm going to focus here on extroversion and introversion because I think this is something we're all familiar with. Let's say we want to measure this in an individual. How do we do this? Well, decades ago, people developed the Big Five personality inventory. And one of the 5 personality dimensions it measures is extroversion, introversion. And the way that this is done is they developed through a tremendous amount of work, this set of 8 items over here on the right. And you simply ask an individual to evaluate themselves on each of these 8 qualities and how much it applies to them. So are you talkative? Do you agree strongly with that or disagree? Are you reserved and so forth? You can see that 5 of these, if you agree with them, you're probably extroverted. And then the other 3, these ones with an R next to them, if you agree with them, you're probably more likely to be introverted. These scales typically include both types of items. And then the way you construct a score for someone to come up with an assessment of them on this dimension is you first reverse these 3 items that are measuring introversion so that they now measure extroversion. So if someone disagrees strongly with being reserved and they've said 1, you give them a 5 instead. And so when you add all of these up after you reverse those 3, the total score indicates how extroverted or introverted you are. If you have a total score of 40, you're at the upper end of extroversion. If you have a total score of 8, you're down at the bottom of the other extreme of introversion. So here's an example of the kind of data that you would see from giving someone the Big Five inventory. This is over here on the left are the scores for 53 individuals. You can see some individuals score highly on this subscale of extroversion, indicating they're highly extroverted, and other people score very relatively low on it, indicating that they're relatively introverted. So we have these scores. We've now sort of assessed people for this dimension. In a way, we've now characterized them as extroverts and introverts. How useful is that? Especially in the face of all the complexity that Corinna was just talking about. Are we really doing justice to what's going on in individuals to kind of attribute them with this quality of some level of extroversion or introversion? So first of all, let's look at where introversion comes from. We can take a systems approach to doing this from the perspective that Corinna talked about. And there's just tons of evidence out there that all of these different levels of causality from institutions down to the individual contribute to someone's personality. So they're going to be contributing to their introversion. So just where introversion comes from is a tremendously complex, multi-layered environmental cultural system. And then within the individual, and I'm not going to say much about this, but what's actually producing their level of extroversion or introversion is an incredibly complex system that involves the brain and the body, the cognitive system, affective system, behavioral system. So there's just complex systems all over the place in terms of where introversion comes from and then what's actually producing it. Now, a common assumption of this kind of work is, and this is the compartmentalization phenomenon that Corinna was referring to, is we assume that once we've established someone's level on this dimension, that they express it in a relatively fixed way across situations where they have an opportunity to express it. But we could ask ourselves, is this really a justified assumption? Is it maybe we have a lot of complexity over on this side as well, where introversion doesn't get expressed in a fixed manner across situations? Well, there have been people who've been arguing this for decades, going back to Walter Mischel and Albert Bandura in the 60s. And they did a lot of work to sort of demonstrate this point. But intuitively, the way that they would present it to people would be, imagine a person in these situations here. And by situation, we typically mean like an event taking place at a particular time in a particular region of space with typically other people present maybe or other artifacts. And so these would all be kinds of situations like that kind of fit that description. So meeting a stranger, reading in the library, talking with a close friend, and attending one's own birthday party. And what they pointed out was, gee, it seems, unlikely that someone would exhibit the exact same level of extroversion or introversion across all these situations. And the reason is if you look at these situations, again, you just see tons of complexity. You see causality coming out of the physical environment, the social environment, available resources, someone's familiarity with the situation, their history with the situation. All of these are going to contribute to how they behave in each of these situations, thereby influencing the potential level of extroversion and introversion that they express. So and so what Michelle and Bandura argued was that there's no such thing as fixed traits, and that when we assess people with standard tools like the Big Five, we're really misleading the community about the nature of behavior and about how particular individuals operate in the world. So I'm just going to show you results from a study that confirm and illustrate what Michelle and Bandura were talking about. So this was a study where we assessed the Big Five across a different set of situations. And we used 21 different situations. 14 of them are shown here. And we simply asked people to evaluate their level of extroversion or introversion in each of these 21 situations. And these are the data. And I know this looks complicated, but it's actually really simple. Each row shows a participant's responses to the 21 situations. So the data for each situation are in a column, and the data for each participant are in a row. And what a red cell means, like this one right here, is that this participant evaluated situation three is saying, I'm very extroverted in this situation. The redder a cell, the more extroverted someone is. The bluer a cell, the more introverted someone is. And so you can see that this first individual is very extroverted in some situations, very introverted in this situation, and in other situations falls somewhere in between. And if you look down the rows at the other 52 participants, you can see almost all participants are exhibiting extroversion in some situations and introversion in others. You can see that there are individual trait level differences like the Big Five captures. So you can see these people here are generally extroverts across most situations, whereas these people down here and in the middle tend to be more introverted, showing higher levels of introversion across situations. You can also see that some situations are more likely to induce extroversion, like situation 4 here, whereas others like 5, 6, and 7 are more likely to induce introversion. So the situation is contributing tremendously to kind of the expression of this personality dimension. The other really important thing here, and this was Corinna's second dimension of complexity, the idea that the same person sees the world, different people see the same world differently, is that these 53 individuals are experiencing these 21 situations very differently. And you can see that. You can just see how there are no two rows are the same. Generally, the people in this cluster are responding to the situations similarly. That's why they're clustered together. But they're even within here, they're all experiencing them differently. And if you look between the different clusters, you can see tremendous differences in how different groups of people are experiencing the same 21 situations. We can quantify this with a statistic called the ICC, which ranges from 0 to 1. It's 1 when everybody experiences the situations identically, 0 when everybody experiences them completely differently. We have 0.29, which it means that there are more differences in how people are expressing extroversion and introversion in these situations than there are similarities. So with this just demonstrates the complexity of what's going on with personality, that it's not just the individual that's affecting, that's contributing to the level of extroversion or introversion that occurs, but also the situation and then the interaction of the individual with the situation. And I'll just say one brief thing about where that seems to be coming from. Different individuals have different cognitive, affective, behavioral systems as a result of their genetics and experience, and this just leads them to experience the same situations differently. So again, tons of complexity. I'll show you one more result and then I'll stop. This is a result from Bill Fleeson's lab in North Carolina, the eastern part that's not flooded. And what they did was they asked people, they rang them up on their mobile phones 3 times a day over the course of a week and just said, how extroverted or introverted are you feeling? So this top panel shows the data for one participant. Basically, and you can see that these are moments of experience where they indicate their level of extroversion or introversion. You can see that this individual on one occasion experienced the maximum amount of extroversion, and on 3 others was near the maximum amount of introversion. And this is not just a cherry-picked example. Every participant exhibits this. You can see this here, that almost every participant has a dark blue and a dark red cell, indicating that they're experiencing the full range of extroversion and introversion across the situations in their life. And that's exactly what Fleeson found. So the situation is having a huge impact on people's level of extroversion and introversion. Down here, what's shown, and this is a little bit more complicated, is he's averaged these points of extroversion and introversion for each participant into a trait level measure of extroversion or introversion for the week. So it's kind of like what the classic Big Five would measure. It gives you an individual's overall level of extroversion or introversion over time. And what's really striking is that the range of variance here only goes from about 5 to 2. The range of variance is less for individuals than it is for situations within an individual. And statistically, you can think of this as the situations contributing more to someone's extroversion or introversion than their personal qualities. And this is something that has been found over and over again in this literature, again, suggesting we shouldn't be compartmentalizing people into like single levels of extroversion and introversion, because that's way too oversimplified and doesn't really do justice to the complexity of how these personality dimensions express themselves across situations. Okay, so one of the things we're up to in SOCITS is developing situated assessment tools to assess people on things like stress and loneliness, in particular Scottish secondary school students, but doing so in a way that begins to tackle this complexity. I think it would be totally inaccurate to say that we're completely capturing this complexity. As Corinna pointed out, there are a lot of things we just can't measure, but at least we're trying to capture some of the complexity. And so the way some of the other activities that contribute to this, we try to identify relevant situations in schools that are important for stress and loneliness using walking interviews and qualitative protocol analyses. And then once we identify these situations, we develop survey instruments like the one I just showed you for the Big Five that attempt to establish trait level differences in individuals, differences between situations, and then interactions that capture how individuals respond differently to the same situations. And then we'll take results from these surveys and integrate them with findings from other parts of the SOCITS framework that includes social network analysis and agent-based modeling, with the idea of providing a broader understanding of stress and loneliness than we would get from typical assessment instruments, that it begins to take into account some of the complexity that's present. Thank you.